7th graders, it's Ms. Glosson here, and today we're going to be talking about the Missoula floods. And really, I want you to watch this about 8-minute video that's going to talk about the process that these floods went through Idaho, eastern Washington, and into Oregon's Willamette Valley. So again, today we're talking about the Missoula floods, and I'm going to show you a video right now that is about 8 minutes long.
Began to fall into the raging torrent until the whole dam just gave way. The collapse of the ice dam released a sea of water. This water then traveled up to 60 miles per hour, rushing headlong towards the scablands. It took only a few hours for the water to reach this once flat landscape. In places, the water was a staggering 800 feet deep. As this volatile torrent flowed ever more quickly, it gouged out miles of rock. It carved out cliffs and canyons, including the massive feature that is known today as Dry Falls. Meanwhile, huge underwater tornadoes were blasting out potholes. The bubbles that formed these tornadoes imploding with enormous force and penetrating deep into the bedrock below. As the chunks of ice from the original glacier were carried huge distances by the floodwaters, the boulders they contained within were randomly flung aside. When the floodwaters receded and the icebergs melted, they would reappear scattered all over the scabland. After a tumultuous journey, this muddy torrent surged out to sea along the floor of the Pacific until it came grinding to a halt over 1,000 miles from its point of origin. It had only taken a few hours to get there. "80 years ago, J. Harlan Bretz shocked the geological establishment with an idea that was seen as heresy. But over the years, more and more scientists gradually began to accept his theory.
Oh, I think Bretz was absolutely delighted to see the vindication of his ideas. I think it all culminated in 1980 when he received the highest medal of the Geological Society of America, the Penrose Medal, which was the final and ultimate recognition that he, in his catastrophic flood hypothesis, had generated one of the great ideas in the earth sciences.
It was left to later generations of geologists to work out the details of how the giant flood had happened. Their research not only confirmed Bretz's outrageous hypothesis, but has recently revealed that, if anything, Bretz was not outrageous enough. For there may have been more than one giant flood. This final twist in the tale centers on one of the classic features of the scablands that has long intrigued geologists. This canyon with its many layered deposits. Richard Waite has been studying these deposits for over 20 years. It was assumed that these layers were formed by changes in the speed of one giant flood, known as pulses. But that was before he discovered something odd, a white line within the sediments.
This is what caught my eye the first time down in the canyon. It's an ash layer from Mount St. Helens. We've analyzed it. Once you become familiar with these ash layers, they become old friends, so I knew what this was. It's an ash layer from Mount St. Helens. It's about 15,000 years old.
Mount St. Helens in Washington state erupts regularly. The ash from the eruption can spread over thousands of square miles, as it did some 15,000 years ago near the time of the Scablands flood. At first, it was thought that the ash had fallen into the water and drifted down into these layers. But could a layer of ash really sink through hundreds of feet of turbulent floodwater to form this amazingly neat, clear line?
This whole column would be full of mud and sand and silt, and to have something settle through it, come out like this, is impossible.
This suggested something completely new. That all these layers weren't laid down together.
It's clear evidence that periodically during the accumulation of this sediment, that there had to have been dry land.
And the implication of that is that there wasn't just one giant flood. Perhaps there were many. After one super flood swept through the Scablands, the floodwaters drained, and there was a period when the land was dry. It was then the ash fell, before another super flood hit and laid more deposits on top. The only way to know whether this theory is true is to date the layers, as Kathleen Nichol is now painstakingly doing.
This is a really thick sequence of rocks, and by looking at the age of the bottommost unit that we can sample, and then the topmost unit, we'll be able to see if it's one great big flood that stacked up a lot of sediment, or whether it was a series of floods coming in every few years, perhaps, over many thousands of years.
It will be years before Kathleen has dated every layer, but her first results show that the top and the bottom layers of the canyon are 20,000 years apart.
We thought that there was just one flood. But now, with these results, we can say with certainty that this area has been repeatedly hit by cataclysmic megafloods again and again.
With these latest results, a culmination of over a century of geological investigation, it now seems that gigantic floods, as well as smaller ones, were a regular feature of this landscape during the Ice Age. Incredibly, ice dams collapsed and reformed in a cycle that rocked the Scablands again and again. Despite the conflict between a catastrophic view of the Scablands and the standard view of gentle continuous change, we now know the truth is somewhere in between. There were huge catastrophes that carved out these giant landscape features, but they were part of a cycle of floods that repeatedly swept through this landscape.
The Channeled Scabland is one of the most fascinating landscapes, and the tremendous catastrophic floods were probably the most spectacular things that happened on the planet. This legacy is part of human history, and I think that it's just an exciting scientific problem.
All right, so you just watched that video, and now I'm just going to review with you what these different things that the Missoula floods created. So the first we call the channeled scablands, and these are throughout eastern Washington, and this is the area that the floods carved out that we can see a lot of the examples of the other types of things that the Missoula floods created. So we can see potholes over here, and throughout this we'd be able to find things like erratics as well. Again, here's what these are the Drumheller channels near Othello, so we can see how the Missoula floods went in and really carved out the rocks. And like I said before, it did it in just seconds, but there was up to 95 different floods that came through the area. And here's another look at what those scablands could look like. And then this is the Frenchman Coulee. It's over by George, Washington. So again, eastern Washington. And you can see how tall this is. And you can see the height of the actual coulee right here compared to these people is quite tall. And again, the Missoula floods created this landscape right here. Here's an example of potholes, which were created by whirlpools going down and bubbles into the landscape, so super deep holes in the ground. And then here is Dry Falls, and Dry Falls is one of it would have been the largest waterfall on the earth if it still had water running over the sides, but today it just has water down below like you can see here. It's 3.5 miles long. And it's 400 feet high. It no longer carries water through it, but it would have been the largest waterfall on Earth if it had water. And also Palouse Falls, which we've talked about this year as being 186 feet tall, a beautiful waterfall in eastern Washington created by the Missoula floods. And then these are erratics, and erratics are the boulders that were picked up and carried by the Missoula floods and then deposited throughout eastern Washington. So they're large boulders, erratics. And those are the things that are created by the Missoula floods. I hope you enjoyed the video and enjoyed the seeing some of the pictures of the things that were created. Make sure you press submit on your Edpuzzle and have a good day.